all folks that are interested, we are also recording the presentation. As you folks noticed, this event is not necessarily in a webinar type of format. We have everybody here, and so I'm going to ask everybody to go ahead and put yourselves on mute. We will have opportunity for interactive Q&A towards the end of our program. So, but please go ahead and mute. You won't have your video on if you'd like, but we'll ask you to stay on mute and to save your questions until the very end. So to kick us off here, my name is Reese Hodges. I work for Idaho Rivers United, based out of our Boise office. We are a statewide organization. Our mission is to protect and restore the rivers of Idaho. And we've been working to pursue that mission for about over 30 years. We were founded in 1990. And our mission takes us across the state to work on issues from the rivers down in southern Idaho and the Owyhee Canyon lands up into the northern Idaho Panhandle. And so today we're here to learn more about what's going on with the Lower Priest River, specifically the Lower Priest River from Priest Lake outlet down to the confluence of the Pend Oreille. And we're joined today by some great guest speakers. Today we have with us some information about efforts to restore cold water fisheries into the Lower Priest River. We're also joined by a guest speaker, Hank Jones, who is a guide and fly fishing outfitter who has also been doing some great work in grassroots organizing and helping to get information out to the public on efforts to restore water quality and cold water fisheries to the Lower Priest River. So I'm on the back end, and yeah, so from here, I guess I just want to make a couple notes before we jump into a presentation from our guest speakers. And I'll say the reason that that IRU is hosting this event is because we heard from some members in the community in the Priest River area that, specifically this summer and a few other low water years, Priest River, Lower Priest River specifically, has struggled quite a bit. So the Priest River is which means that native bull trout and mountain whitefish are not doing very well in the Lower Priest River. Meanwhile, a lot of folks in the community and those that have been working on the Priest River, especially from the Kalispel Tribe, see a brighter future for this river. And so that's why we wanted to bring them on here to share information about their work. And then, if we have some time, we'll also speak a little bit to Idaho Fish and Game's cold water bypass, not proposal, but the work they've been doing to look at cold water bypass as a potential method to restore cold water into the Priest River. So that's an overview of why we're here. Thank you so much for joining us. From here, I'm going to pass it off to Eric and Mike at the Kalispel Tribe, and we're going to bring up their slide presentation here. So that should fill everybody's screens. And again, if you could please stay on mute, and we'll stick questions until the very end of the program. So if you have questions for Mike and Eric, we'll get through the whole program, leave some time for Q&A. So I'll kick it off and pass it off to Eric and Mike. So thanks so much for joining us, you guys.
Yeah, thank you very much, Reese. I'll start off and then I'll pass it off to Eric here in a minute. But my name is Mike Lithgow. I'm the Information and Outreach Coordinator and Policy Analyst for the Kalispel Tribe's Natural Resources Department. And yeah, so I really appreciate the invite to come speak a little about the Kalispel and their connection to the landscape, especially in the Panhandle of Idaho. And so, yeah, if you could move to the next slide, please. So I think it's important to provide some context, just some geographic context of why we're here talking to you today, and kind of a little bit of history. So the map that you are looking at is kind of small, but it kind of has to be to show the footprint of the Kalispel historically. So the Aboriginal lands that the Kalispel utilized is 1.3 million acres of land, all the way up to Salmo, British Columbia, and over into Noxon, Montana area. That includes Priest Lake, Pend Oreille Lake, basically the Pend Oreille River watershed in most of its entirety in those areas. So as you can imagine, historically travel was difficult without roads, before horses. The riverways were the transportation corridors. That was the best, fastest way to move around the landscape. And that's kind of which defined the Kalispel people. Back in the early 1900s, the Kalispel were given a reservation and placed on that reservation by the federal government through an executive order. And that reservation is the very, very tiny little gold strip that you see near the Usk area. So that little strip of land is where the Kalispel currently reside on their reservation. But the lands in the dark area on that map are important to the Kalispel historically, and the next map will show you a little more detail of why. So this map is really cool and really important. This map was documented shortly after, in the early 1900s as well. An ethnographer came up and was able to interview many of the Kalispel elders that were still alive at the time to document parts of the language, just all kinds of really important information that they had to share. And so this is a very primitive form of GIS, basically. Though all those points and those associated numbers, there's a key to this map that identifies and those are all resources that the Kalispel depended on for their survival. So you'll see areas where they would hunt caribou or lynx. There's lots of areas where fishing and waterfowl hunting occurred. And so you can see that Priest Lake, Priest River, the mouth of the river, there was lots of areas as families would have seasonal encampments in these important places where the resources were available at the time. So as you can see on the right there, camas, deer, all these other resources that were really important to the Kalispel people. And that's how those areas were named. I mean, everything, imagine your whole world revolving around where you would get those next resources that would sustain you, your family, and your community. So, I mean, the connection to the land is deep. I am personally, I'm a fourth generation Pend Oreille County resident. That is so, compared to some of the people I work with, they've been here, for 10,000 years, their family. So it's just, it's an honor to work for the Kalispel. And we are not in Montana. We are in Montana, but not Kalispel, Montana. We are in this area where you see the map, and these resources are super important to us, just like they are to the people that have only been here a year, that have moved here from California or wherever. We all share a passion for this place, and the next slide, I'm gonna transfer over to Eric so he can give you a much deeper dive onto the specific Lower Priest River. So take it away, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Just hear me okay, I hope. Yeah, so I work with Mike. I'm a hydrologist. My name's Eric Bernsten. I'm a hydrologist, geomorphologist with the tribe. And a lot of my daily work is sort of looking at our Aboriginal land area that Mike laid out in the last couple maps and identifying areas to restore. And we've been doing quite a bit of work on the Lower Priest, I'd say the last 10 years or so. And that's kind of what I want to hit in this talk, is just the sort of three key projects on the Lower Priest that we've been engaged in the last 10 years or so. So this is we're actually I live in Sandpoint, and so the NRCS office is about, I don't know, 2 miles from my house. And so we went up there a few months ago and looked through their historic aerial collection, which they have available in both flat folders and yeah, pretty much just going through old map files. But this is a 1946 aerial of the Priest River in the vicinity of Maccabee Falls. It's kind of flipped 90 degrees to fit it on the slide here, but this is, you know, pre-outlet dam. But it showed, you know, there is some development. There's obviously a lot of meandering there. We have a low gradient river, a lot of interesting, you know, bed forms and side kind of oxbows. And so there's just a lot of, you know, floodplain connection back in the day. But, you know, I'll get into, in my talk, I'll talk about some of the legacy impacts to the Priest River, which is not restricted to just the Priest. I mean, it's kind of a common theme that we hear all throughout the Northwest. So I'll try to hit upon those points. And like Reese said, we want to make this interactive. We want you guys, you know, if you have questions, save up for the end and we'll try to field them. But so next slide, if we could. There it goes. So here's our study area. We mentioned the lower Priest. We're going to talk about sort of the 72 kilometer, 45 mile area from the outlet dam down to the mouth. And so these are all kind of the major tributaries. And we'll get to these later, how these play an influence on water temperature and also the implications for some of our cutthroat trout work. But there's about 18 major tributaries. There's a lot of groundwater inputs in the lower river. And so, yeah, this is kind of what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes, just keying in on this particular area. So the lower Priest it's temperature impaired. It's listed on the latest Idaho DEQ 303D list. I mean, that's regulatory code for, you know, impaired water bodies. It's impaired for temperature throughout the whole main stem. It's also impaired for sediment. So basically temperature and sediment are impairing or impacting the beneficial uses of the lower Priest River. And so, yeah, let's go to the next slide. Well, this picture actually, before we do that, this is a bull trout. Brian Whitty is kind of heading up he's working on our cutthroat project on Big Creek, Quartz Creek, Sanborn, and Sadler. So those are kind of in the lower third of that study area picture there. So we'll get into more detail on that, but nice big bull trout that came out of, I think, Upper Priest Lake. So, you know, the Priest River has a pretty good run of bull trout. Most of them seem to be going up the East River drainage, which is kind of up in the top 2/3 there. You see it on that figure on the right. And that's where they tend to do the most spawning, is up that system there. Next slide. So yeah, I'll start. The first of the 3 projects I'm going to talk about is some Westslope Cutthroat monitoring. They've been working on the tributary. So our cutthroat species, I don't know how many of you folks are from Southern Idaho, you're probably from all over the state, but there's, I think, 14 subspecies of cutthroat trout. And so the one that we're most focused on, the one that's endemic to our area, is the Westslope Cutthroat. So it's in the Onoricus genus. And so back in our area, we didn't really know a whole lot about Westslope Cutthroat, at least in the Priest River system. So back around, 10 plus years ago, 2011, we decided to take the shocking boat out by the mouth where the Priest dumps into the Pend Oreille near the town of Priest River, and kind of see what was out there. I mean, a lot of this fisheries work, I mean, I'm sort of a different kind of ologist. As I mentioned, I'm a hydrologist, geomorphologist. So we have a whole fish side of the house, and they really enjoy going out electrofishing. I've personally done it before. It's kind of it's like a, Christmas present. You never know what you're going to catch, but we found some pretty good sized adult pure strain cutthroat at the mouth. And so that kind of led us to delve into, where are these guys going? Where are they coming from? What are their migration habitats? Where are they spawning? And so this is some work that was done by Todd Anderson. Some of you folks might know him. He's down in Boise now, actually working for NOAA, but he was with us for a number of years, and he kind of started this work, looking at where these adult cutthroat were moving into the system and where they're spawning. And so from about 2012, 2015, we spent an awful lot of effort radio tagging these fish. And so radio tagging, and again, next slide talks about hit tags and setting up hit tag arrays. I mean, a huge amount of effort trying to track these fish. And then really from 2013 to present, we've got this ongoing work in the spawning tributary. So we'll go to the next slide. Sorry for the delay. We've got a lot of eye candy in this presentation. Mike and I like pictures, so sorry, I might be slowing down everything, but yeah, a little more specifics on the tributary monitoring. And so Joe Conrath, who's our new fishery biologist at the tribe, he's going to be heading up this project, and Brian Whitty, as I mentioned before. Yeah, this is sort of a community effort. This takes a lot of personnel time and effort to instrument these 4 tributaries. Like I said, the 4 tributaries we're looking at are Big Creek, Quartz Creek, Sadler, and Sanborn. These are some of the major spawning tributaries on the lower Priest River. So each of these sites is instrumented. We've got a weir here. This is basically with a pit tag array. And a pit tag is basically, if you think about, I mean, I've got 3 dogs. They all are microchipped. I mean, it's like a fish microchip, if you will. So we're basically implanting these little microtransmitters, and we're able to track these fish throughout the system. And so if we recapture them in subsequent years, we can actually calculate growth and do some of that kind of work, some of those kind of metrics. So yeah, but setting up the infrastructure for this is a real labor intensive thing. And we've been pretty successful, and we've gotten some pretty good data, which the next slide will show. So Caitlin, if we can advance to the next slide. Okay, so this is a pretty data-intensive slide, so I'll try to unpack this. But so what do we know about Westslope and the Priest River system? So we know from almost 10 years of data of tracking these guys that the fish tend to move up into these major tributaries. And again, we're really focusing mostly on these lower 4 here. They'll swim in from the main stem March 1st, tend to spawn in late April. And then they hang around. They basically stick around for about 2 years or so, and they get to a nice, fat, sassy size of 48 inches, and then they'll migrate out into the main stem. And Brian and his crew have done some aging on these things, Todd, and presumably they're age 2 or 3, and then they start out migrating into the main stem and kind of work their way up into the main stem pond array, which is about 15 miles downstream. And then they basically go up in the lake, and then they tend to come back and come in and spawn maybe every year, every 2 years. But they'll get pretty big between, age 2, age 3. They'll get into like 12, 16 inches. And we've got Westslope up to 20 inches that have seen. In fact, I've personally caught them in the Priest, and that lends me, I think Hank will probably talk about the potential of this fishery. I mean, there's a lot of really good sized Westslope in this system. They'll get up to, 20 inches or so. And so they'll come in and keep using these same spawning tribs year after year. So this is what fishery biologists call an allocustrine adfluvial life history. So it just means that they're going to spend a couple of years in the spawning tributaries and get large enough to outmigrate, and then spend time in sort of the larger lake and the larger main stem. And it's a very similar life history to what we see in the bull trout population on the East River. So the cutthroat and the East River bull trout are pretty much following that same life history. So that's something, we never would have known unless we did that mouth of Priest River electrofishing and set up these pit tag arrays and start tracking these fish. So that's a little bit, and again, that's an ongoing project. Joe Conrath is going to be managing that, and so there'll be some good data coming out of that. So next slide. Cool. Okay, so this is the second of 3 projects I want to mention. So we're interested in looking at, like I said, the Priest River, the main stem is listed for temperature. It's impaired for temperature. And Reese, I think I've got a question from Rick. Do we want to, maybe we'll just hold this till the end. Is that how we want to do it? I mean, it's up to you guys. We can do it interactive as well, but maybe we'll hold that to the end. I don't have a whole lot of slides, so maybe we'll just go through the rest and kind of address all the questions at one time. So yeah, this is the second project. So we've been trying to get a handle on the sort of the spatial oh, well, before I go into the temperature stuff, this is actually, yeah, let me backtrack. This is related to temperature, but we are, there's been an interest in sort of identifying or at least characterizing the habitat of the lower Priest River. And so this is some work that we started in 2011. The tribe gathered what's called EMAP data, which is it's an EPA, US EPA protocol for medium-sized rivers. And medium-sized rivers are basically rivers that are between 30 and 60 meters wide. And so this is it's a 70 in the Pacific Northwest. There's 78 rivers in this data set. So folks were out gathering data. The Priest is one of those data points. So 2011, the tribe gathered data along 11 separate reaches along the Priest River. And so this is basically, and then we hired USGS to kind of make sense of this data. So we had all this habitat data, and we actually, since temperature was kind of an issue with the main stem, we wanted to relate the habitat characteristics to temperature. And so these are, just to describe this graph here, this is the graphic on the left. It's just the location of these 78 sites. So we've got latitude and longitude. And then that small graph on the right, the upper right, is water temperature on the y-axis in Celsius, and then the quartile group. So breaking down these 78 sites into different percentages. And so it's based on modeled Norwest data. So those Boise folks might recognize Norwest data comes from the Forest Service experiment, the station down in Boise. Actually, Dan Isaac and his crew down in Boise generated modeled August mean stream flows for all these particular river sites. And so Priest River sort of lies in that upper quartile. So it's pretty warm compared to the rest of the rivers in this data set. So just for comparison's sake, Middle Fork of the Flathead, some folks up here in North Idaho know where that is. That's over sort of east of Kalispel, Montana. That's the coldest river in the data set. And John Day is the warmest. So that's kind of, great smallmouth fishery down there in Oregon, but that's a pretty warm stream. It kind of comes out of the high desert. So the idea here with this project is to put the Priest River in sort of this regional context, moving forward. And that we felt like it was helpful for sort of discussions and maybe identifying potential restoration measures. But the first step was kind of putting it into the regional context. So that's what this all. And we published a paper. It was actually Francine Mejia was the lead author on that from USGS, and that's available I can certainly put a link to that. That's an open access journal article. We try to publish everything open access so people don't have to pay crazy amounts of money to journals to access them. So this is open access, is totally free. So I'm happy to provide that link to that article for folks on the call. Next slide. And part of that analysis was looking at incision height. So incision height is defined as basically the height from the water surface, pretty much during the summer, to the height of the next sort of landformed surface above bankful height. So I know that's a mouthful. I probably could have put a graphic in there, but that's kind of that's our definition of incision. So it's basically a measure of how far below the stream bed is from that floodplain terrace. And so it's a measure of, how disconnected that main stem river is to the floodplain. And so the Priest River, again, it's sort of in that upper quartile of incision. I mean, the average incision level, and that's what this graphic shows here. It's got incision height and then the quartile groups. The mean incision height for that whole 72-kilometer stretch is about 3.2 meters. So in English units, it's about 10 feet. And so that's a pretty significant amount. And that's sort of in that upper quartile of incision depths that we see in that big 78 river data set in the Northwest. And there are a couple of reasons for that. This paper, and again, I'll get you guys this link. We go into discussion about what probably caused that incision. And there's a huge body of literature. I wouldn't say huge, but in the Northwest, there's been some folks that have really started to look into legacy impacts to streams from logging and other disturbance, but primarily logging. And so what we think happened in the Priest River, starting in say the 1890s or so and going up into about the 1930s, you had this widespread clearing of the landscape for logging, and that would basically introduce a whole bunch of sediment into the system. And so you'd get these high flows every year, say May or June or so, that would flush that fine sediment up on the floodplain, but it would sort of degrade. So it would basically get higher and higher, and that terrace would get higher and higher. And then the subsequent higher flows would never be able to activate that floodplain. So it's kind of an accelerated natural levee process, if that makes sense. And so over time, and this is pre-dam, what probably happened is you basically, all those flows are contained within that higher than natural floodplain terrace. And so that led to some incision. And then also sort of the double whammy was some of these log drives. And that really, if you kind of can envision huge rafts of logs coming down the system, they have the real potential of scouring out the bed and the banks and pretty much deepening and widening the whole channel. So I think that's kind of the conceptual model of what's going on in the Priest River. So hopefully that makes sense. We could talk about that during the Q&A, but we see that pattern a lot in logged watersheds. It's certainly not restricted to just the Priest River system. So go to the next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about moving away from some of the habitat analysis work we've been doing. Now we're getting into some of the temperature work. And so this, and unfortunately Fish and Game couldn't make it today, but this was kind of the beginning of the feasibility analysis for a cold water bypass for to cool down main stem temperatures in the river. And so we worked with Chris Berger at Portland State this is all model data, basically modeled temperature downstream from the outlet down to the mouth. And so the left side of the axis is basically outlet dam. So river kilometer 72. And we've shown a few of the key tributaries that introduce cold water to the system. So Bernard's Creek is about 3 kilometers down or so, about 5 kilometers down from the outlet. Lost Landing is another sort of cold water input in the East River. And so what's interesting about the modeled data, and this is actually, and I'll show you, we've got actual data that shows the same pattern. A lot of rivers this size typically warm up as they move down from upstream to downstream, but the Priest River is a little bit different in that it's kind of got this natural cooling system. It starts off fairly warm under present conditions, but it does cool down, as you move downstream. And so that's something, that may factor into any kind of mitigation we end up doing or sort of restoration, but it's just sort of an interesting pattern. And there's been some papers published that talk about sort of temperature regimes of rivers worldwide, and a lot of rivers don't really fit this kind of model. So it's kind of interesting. So this is just, water temperature is on the y-axis, and then distance upstream is on the x-axis. So again, I want to caution, this is model data. It's using a model called SQL, which is a one-dimensional kind of hydraulic model that models temperature. So yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm moving into some of the real world data. So this was a sort of a multi-faceted temperature study that we started back in 2018. So I'm just showing you just a little bit of this stuff, and we're still working up this data, and we'll have some publications out at some point on this stuff. But one of the components of this was doing a temperature longitudinal profile. So that's looking at the temperature along the entire main stem at the same time. And so back in August of 2018, we had the river was broken down into 10 different segments. And Hank was one of the folks, I don't know which segment you were, Hank, but he took part in that study. And we had it was a huge volunteer effort. I'd say most of the volunteers were from Panhandle Trout Unlimited chapter, but we had a whole bunch of different folks help out with this. We basically, the top graph shows water temperature, and then the x-axis, y-axis shows temperature, and the x-axis shows the distance upstream. So we broke the river down to 10 different segments, different sizes, and the sizes were varied depending on ease of put in and take out. And I mean, there were a couple of different factors, landowner access. But this was something that was Francine at USGS really kind of masterminded this whole thing, reached out to landowners, and really did the study design for this. So a couple of things I want to point out on the actual data. So we started the project, this profile at 10 o'clock in the morning on August 21st, 2018. It was like a 100-degree day. It was a pretty hot one. But a couple of things that kind of jumped out at us as we looked at the data. The top graph is just the raw water temperature data. So the way this worked is we had these 10 teams, and they were dragging what are called pressure transducers that had temperature logging capability. So we were looking at depth We're also gathering temperature as we work down. So all these different, I'd save the picture of the different floatables, but we had a whole, it was a whole host of different floating devices. You had, inflatable cataracts, you name it, people were floating down, but it all sort of served the same purpose to gather this longitudinal temperature profile data. And so if you look at the section or segment 1 there is basically from the outlet dam down to about river kilometer 63.8 or so. That area, one thing that kind of jumped out at us is, all these segments start at the same time. They started at 10 o'clock in the morning, but if you look at the outlet dam segment, it's pretty much the warmest at the start, if you look at all those other segments. So that kind of corroborates with Chris Berger's model data from the slide before. So we know the water is the warmest coming out of the outlet. But it also shows, in segment 1 again, like river kilometer 65, you see that basically that deflection or that decrease in temperature there. Well, that coincides pretty nicely with Bernard's Creek, which I'll show you a picture of that. That's an 8C tributary that's basically pumping cold water in year round. And so even with this detrended or undetrended raw data, you can sort of tease out some patterns here. So the lower graph, we did some sort of data analysis and we calculated what are called the residuals, and that's what's on the y-axis. That's basically the difference between the actual temperature and what the mean temperature was for that whole day in the river. And so that's basically a technique to sort of, dampen out the noise and actually sort of get at some of the overall trends. And so that's where we can really start looking at where these cold water inputs are. And so we can actually look on aerial photos and look at pictures and tie those to actual physical features. So that's what we're trying to do here on the lower graph. This is residuals on the y-axis. Again, the temperature, the difference between the actual temperature and the mean temperature during the day, and then the distance upstream on the x-axis. And so we're able to tie these low temperature points to actual physical features on the landscape, things like tributaries, spring brooks, which are kind of these little cold side channels, wetlands and seeps, and those are real prominent down around river kilometer 30. So this is downstream of East River. We see a lot of groundwater input coming in there. So next slide. So this slide shows the same graphic on top there we just talked about. And these are just some of the pictures of those physical features. So we've got, tributary near 68, that's Bernard's Creek. So Bernard's, those of you from around here, I mean, it's a real cold canyon. I mean, that water is pretty much 8 to 10 C year round, and it's a perennial stream. So it's a pretty good cold water input to the lower Priest. Here's a spring brook near river kilometer 65. So that's kind of a cold water side channel. It's probably getting a lot of seepage off the hillside, off kind of to the west. And then near river kilometer 30, we get a bunch of these wetland seeps coming in. Again, probably 8 to 10 seawater coming in. And so one of the things we had folks do is they were doing these longitudinal profiles is actually document, did they see any fish or any evidence of fish use? And the team that was actually doing this segment, which was, I think it was segment 4 or so, they documented, more than 100 fish in this pool, and they're probably whitefish. We've been back to that section before, but they're basically gravitating towards that nice deep cold water pool there. So we'll go to the next slide. And part of this temperature work too, and again, we're sort of writing this up now and going to publish this in peer-reviewed journals, but this is, I'm actually sort of heading up this portion of the project where we're calculating, coming up with some kind of metrics of how disconnected the main stem is from the floodplain. And so without getting into too much detail, the one thing that's really nice about the Priest River, we have a really nice long-term flow data set down by Priest River. The USGS gauge there has been in service since I think 1903, and there's continuous flow data from about 1928 till present, and I don't think there's any chance of closing that gauge down. So it's really one of Idaho's what they call sentinel gauges. I mean, long-term, almost 100-year data set. And so we're able to calculate what that flooding extent is for the annual flow. The annual flow in the Priest is about 2,000 CFS, give or take. And so with detailed topography, detailed bathymetry on the river, we can figure out what the lateral extent of flooding that is. So that's this dark blue here is kind of the current geomorphic floodplain. It's not the 100-year floodplain. It's basically what's flooded under that historic annual flow series. And the historic geomorphic floodplain is what we think, that's based on some of the incision values that came out of that Mejia paper. That's basically applying those incision values up and down this part of the main stem. This is actually from Upper West Branch down to about East River, looking at what that historic floodplain could potentially flood to. And so there's a lot, I'll sort of leave with this thought. There's a lot of thinking that's sort of evolved over the last 10 years that, floodplains probably flood a lot more often than we think. I mean, I think we're in the middle. There's sort of this concept called shifting baselines. And I think a lot of folks think about incised channels and only accessing floodplain every 100 years. And that's not always the case. And there's a lot of good literature support for that. And so that's kind of our assumption here in parts of the Priest is that the valley wall probably flooded, on an annual basis, or at least semi-annual basis. So anyway, we're trying to, and we can actually crunch the numbers here and figure out how much floodplain has been lost over time and figure out how much habitat could be created. So this is kind of in the works. But again, that EMAP data showed that we have a lot of floodplain disconnection, a lot of incision, side channel abandonment compared to that 78 river data set and the EMAP data set. So next slide. So yeah, this is my last slide. So yeah, just acknowledgments. Again, this is a lot of folks have helped us over the years, and I just touched upon, these are really the three major projects we've been working on in the last 10 years in the Lower Priest. So KNRD, Brian Whitty, and many other folks over the years and staff. Todd Anderson, I mentioned his name. He was with the tribe for a number of years. Now he's down in Boise. USGS has helped us out a lot with the temperature and the EMAP data, Francine and Christian. EPA, Phil Kaufman's out of Corvallis. He helped us a lot with the crunching the EMAP data on some of that habitat work. And we actually went out and got some bathymetry data from Freshwater Map. So they were a contractor out of Big Fork, Montana, and they floated the entire river back in 2018 and got really detailed bathymetry information. We were able to link that up with the LiDAR information that already existed. And then we couldn't have done, some of this work, especially the longitudinal profile temperature work, without volunteers. So we had Panhandle TU help out quite a bit. And then the Idaho Master Naturalists, we have a really active chapter in Sandpoint that helped us out as well. So I think next slide is probably the last one. Lemnensis Salish for thank you. So yeah, I think we'll wait till the end for questions. I saw a lot popping in, so that's really cool.
Yeah, a lot of great questions coming in. Thanks so much, Eric and Mike, for sharing information from the Kalispel Tribe's work. It's really interesting to learn what kind of research is being done on the state of the fisheries there, and great to see the amount of collaboration as well. So yeah, folks, so from here, we're going to hear from Hank Jones, who is a fly fishing guide and outfitter who knows the Priest River well as other rivers in the region. And Hank has been involved with some community members there in doing kind of some grassroots organizing and getting good information out to the public about efforts to restore cold water fisheries to the Priest River. So from here, I'm going to pass it off to Hank, and he can share a little bit about what he's been up to.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, all right. Bit of background about how I got involved or how I found the Priest. I moved to the area to take over management of the Kalispel Duck Club, which is Washington's oldest hunting club, located here in Usk, about 20 miles west of the Priest River. And I also moved here to start my own fishing guiding service. So a bunch of research went into that. The majority of my operations take place on the Upper Columbia, but seasonally I shift focus over into Idaho, onto the Kootenai River, Lower Clark Forks. A lot of suspects kept popping up. You hear about the Coeur d'Alene all the time because it's an amazing trout fishery, the St. Joe, Lake Pend Oreille. Kootenai River, even the Spokane, but I never ever saw any mention of the priest. Never knew it existed till I moved to the area. And so I remember I found it just, living close by and driving along it and saying, "Holy smokes, how's this place not holding fish? I've never heard of this." People kept telling me that there wasn't many fish in there, and I said, "Well, I got to figure that out for myself." So of course I went and fished it, and just as everybody said, it's pretty low fish densities, but it was kind of perplexing because there's great structural habitat, there's deep holes, log jams, fantastic cover, fantastic macroinvertebrate life, great entomology. So the food was there, stoneflies, healthy stoneflies, which are generally considered an indicator species, and which means if a river system is polluted, they're the first to go. So pollution obviously wasn't an issue, and it came down to temperature. And so about that time, I remember hearing the inklings of Idaho Fish and Game's ideas to start restoring cold water to the river, and inquired about it and seeing what I could contribute and how I could help. And they said there wasn't really much you could do right now. It's still in the research phases and just sit tight. But I was encouraged to apply for an outfitter's license, which I did and eventually obtained. And about that same time, I think Idaho Fish and Game and the Kalispel Tribe were really picking up some momentum, and also picking up some speculation along with that. So it became pretty apparent that there was a way we could help, and that was to create a voice for the public to show support for the restoration of Priest River. A couple other folks and myself kind of brainstormed and put our heads together and decided there's a couple things to start that we needed were a website and a petition. And Jeremy Patterson and a friend of his put their heads together and created the website www.priestriverproject.org. And Jeremy and I have collaborated on the content and the management of that a little bit. The intent of that website was really to create a place for people to explore the articles in the media that have been getting written and surrounding the issues on the Priest River, and showcase the research that was being done by the tribe and Fish and Game. We also needed to create a platform for the conservation organizations, the businesses, other entities to publicly show their support for an endorsement for the Priest River restoration efforts. And we also wanted a place for people to be able to find the contact information for legislators, decision makers, Idaho Fish and Game officials, so that if they wanted to write them letters and engage them directly, they could. And finally, it served as a link to the petition. The petition was drafted by myself with the help of some friends. I hope they don't mind me mentioning their names. Mike and Jill Williams helped me edit it, and John Quinn Hurst, who's here today from Selkirk Conservation Alliance, had some input on that as well. And the intention behind the petition was to create a way for people to take action and voice their support for the research and the restoration efforts surrounding Priest. Also, we needed a method to express to the legislators and decision makers that there was a pretty strong public outcry and public interest demanding that these issues be recognized and addressed and dealt with. And then finally, on the petition, there's a link back to the website to kind of create some sort of circular continuity to get people, whether they were introduced to the issues via the petition, they could get back to the website, or if they were introduced via the website, they could get to the petition. In developing support for this petition and the website, on a personal level, I really relied on my network of guiding community and the people that I developed relationships through my guiding business, clients, friends, other guides, outfitters. I was also put in contact and reached out personally to a lot of these conservation organizations like Idaho Rivers United, who has been obviously a fantastic help in putting this together. Other organizations involved, Idaho Wildlife Federation. Kyle Mackey's written a couple articles about the Priest and the cold water issues. Daniel Ritz, also of Idaho Wildlife Federation, will be putting out some media soon. Backcountry Hunters and Anglers recently got on board, and Cody Montgomery wrote a Actually, I think they just posted an article yesterday on it. Nick Vasciano has also been a great help there. North Idaho Flycasters, endless help. Richard Burkett, their president, has been just every time I need a hand reaching out to an organization that won't give me the time of day, he's right there to pick up and try and get in touch with them as well. So I'm grateful to him. And Spokane Riverkeepers have recently gotten involved. But all these entities, you know, they have the ability to write articles and stimulate their membership to engage and potentially educate themselves and sign a petition. I've kind of run, I guess I've exhausted that resource as far as the conservation organizations. There's some that I'm still trying to get on board and working with. But it certainly seems like I need to start figuring out other methods of engagement and outreach. And so presently I've been contacting sales reps in the fishing industry, whether it be an Orvis rep or a Sims rep. You know, these guys they're born salesmen. That's what they do. They go from town to town. They go from shop to shop. They're talking to people all the time. They're great at what they do. So they're a great way to spread the word. But I think the other key element to that is they've got their finger on the pulse in that industry, and they know the people who have strong online media presence. I'm not familiar with Instagram and Facebook. It's not something I use, but I recognize their utility in getting a message out to a huge amount of people in a very short amount of time. So I'm hoping they can put me in touch with more of those individuals. And if I can get them to engage and continue spreading the message, I think it would be a huge help. What can we do as individuals? You know, I mean, it's pretty simple. Ideally, go to the website, educate yourself on the issues. That way, when you're engaged in conversation, you know, you have ammunition, you have the information and you're well informed to hold those conversations. Sign the petition if you haven't. That'd be fantastic. I would greatly appreciate that. Write your legislators. That would be a huge one. You know, if enough of those letters come in, they've got to pay attention. And then just continue spreading the word. You know, it's been nearly 72 years, I think, since the dam went in, about 3/4 of a century. And that dam cut off fish passage from Priest River to Priest Lake during July, August, September, during the critical months when they need that cold water the most. They could at least migrate up there. Now they can't. It more than likely has elevated the temperatures of Priest River during those months as well. And it is, I mean, definitely, it cut the flow of Priest River in half. We have the research to show that. There's flow data dating from 1911 and 1949, leading up to the construction of the dam. So we know how much less water there is in that river now. Without question, it's had devastating effects to the health of Priest River and its native fish species. You know, a mere fraction of that water that comes out of Priest River is sold for downstream hydroelectric needs, just a tiny little bit. So all that water being held in Priest Lake is for the benefit of restoration, because people want to be up there playing. There was a massive fish kill on Priest River last year. We lost a lot of fish. Animals are dying because we want to play on Priest Lake. Animals are dying because we're mismanaging this resource. We're morally and ethically obligated to right this wrong and fix the mistakes of the past. We're not calling for dam removal. We're not calling for a water level change. We're trying to be cooperative and cognizant of other points of views and others' desires. So IDFG and the Kalispel Tribe, they're researching alternative methods of cold water restoration. It's a no-brainer project. It's a win situation for everybody. It's just a win-win. And the other thing is, it's not that hard. It's 100% attainable. It's not simple, but we can get this done. So I would say, please go out and educate people, try and spread the word and get them engaged in signing the petition. So that's what I got. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Hank. Really appreciate you sharing a bit about your connection to the Priest River, and then also on kind of the grassroots organizing efforts that are going on there. My kind of takeaway is just, bottom line is the Priest River needs some love, and it needs people to keep their thoughts and efforts focused on the effort to bring Priest River back in terms of health for cold water fisheries, and just envision a future where fisheries and recreation can thrive on that lower river, because from what I've heard from community members, that there's a lot of folks are very much interested in seeing that future. So just a few minutes left here for Q&A to keep it under an hour. So we have a few questions that are already in the chat, and yeah, please, if you have any more questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. I think that will be easier than doing it via audio. So I'm just going to scroll back up here. So we had a question from Rick. Why don't the adults, referring, I'm guessing, the Westslope Cutthroat, go up to Priest Lake rather than the Pond Array? So let's hear, Eric, could you answer that question for?
Yeah, that's a good question. God, I wish we had some fish biologists on the call, but yeah, it's hard to say. I think, the outlet dam is probably providing some kind of barrier, but we know for whatever reason, it seems like most of the cutthroat are going those lower tributaries that we're instrumenting. So yeah, good question. I mean, I think from talking to the fish folks in our house and talking to our agency folks, a lot of the salmonids in our area have a very, they call it plastic life history. I mean, they're really adaptable. And so I think they're kind of evolved to really deal with changing conditions. So yeah, I think, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but yeah, we don't really know. I think there's just, we know that with bull trout that bull trout tend to hopscotch, at least in the Box Canyon Reservoir on the Washington side. We think that bull trout tend to hopscotch from cold patch to cold patch. It just wasn't uniformly cold throughout the whole system. So yeah, I think I can refer Rick's question to Brian or some of our fish folks, and maybe there's one of those guys online, but yeah.
Could I add something to that?
Sure.
Well, certainly there is the possibility that they could migrate up during certain parts of the year, but during those critical months of July, August, September, the flow coming out of the dam is low enough that those fish are not able to return to Priest Lake. That's documented. And that would be the critical time when they need to. The rest of the year, they can survive in the river. They're happy to survive in the river. That's where they want to be. It's during the heat of the summer that they would generally move up into Priest Lake during July, August, September.
Okay, thank you, Eric and Hank. Let's see here. Another question we had is, let's see here. So there was a question about a culvert-like structure that's under Highway 57 at Bernarch Creek. And so I guess the question is if that is a fish migration barrier.
Yeah, that I'm not aware of, but that's something I could follow up with Paul offline, but that's something where, yeah, the Forest Service will do their barrier surveys, and Idaho does things a little bit differently than Washington. Washington has a pretty well codified way of figuring out whether you have a fish barrier or not, and I don't think Idaho follows the same process, but yeah, I have to follow up with some of our folks on the Panhandle Forest on that. But
Okay, thanks, Eric.
I'll follow up with Paul offline. Yeah, be happy to.
Okay, great. Let's see here. Another question we have from Todd is are the same high temperature trends apparent on the upper Priest River above Priest Lake and above the dam, or is the problem of the high temperature trends unique to the lower Priest River below the outlet dam?
Yeah, a good place to look for that would be, yeah, DEQ has their watershed, basically their analysis for the temperature TMDL, and so looking at impairments. And so I think, they have loggers in some of those upper Priest Lake tributaries, and so some of them exceed temperature standards. So my guess would be that they do, but this is, I was focused more on that. We did a lot of detailed information on lower Priest, as you saw, where we instrumented, we did the longitudinal profiles. We also instrumented every 2 kilometers in the main stem and looked at all the tribs, and DEQ they don't go to that level of detail. But yeah, my question, I can follow up with Todd offline too. Todd, if you send me your information, I can follow up offline and find out some more information for you if you want. But I think it's part of the overall Priest Basin temperature TMDL. I want to say that they did look at some of those other tribs. It's not just the main stem that's listed for higher temperatures. Some of those other tribs too. Hughes Fork comes to mind up that does drain into the upper Priest.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Let's see here. Another question that we have is, it's a question about mitigation from hydropower projects. Well, as we know, the outlet dam is actually, it's not a hydropower dam. It's just to control the lake level. But the question is that does the Idaho Department of Water Resources have to pay for any mitigation for impacts to fisheries in the Lower Priest River since they manage the dam?
I mean, I'm not aware of anything on the books that would hold them for mitigation. I think all these questions really, and one thing that I think Hank alluded to, and one thing we've really been working on is coming up with kind of a basin collaborative, a Priest River Basin collaborative that deals with all the different interests. I mean, Priest River has all kinds of issues, right? It's not just main stem temperature issues. There's a number of different things that are sort of going on. And I think, yeah, this is something where we could look at operation of the dam. And I think this all argues towards having a collaborative approach with different viewpoints, different stakeholders, and really hammering out solutions. And I think I've been part of these different processes in the past. And sometimes the solutions, you don't know them up front, right? A priori. I mean, we're going to come up, you get smart people together and different viewpoints, and you're going to come up with things that you don't even anticipate are solutions. So I see this as, if there is a financial, I mean, we'll see, that might come out as part of that collaborative process. So that's kind of how I'd answer that. But yeah, the Kalispel Tribe, Hank and some of those folks, Fish and Game are really supportive of this collaborative process. I think it's not very productive to kind of duke it out on social media. I think we need to hear from all parties and come up with solutions to fix this basin. So.
Thanks so much, Eric. And I guess I would have a question just kind of on that note is if we are aware of any opportunities, any public meetings coming up in the future, or any opportunities for engagement for folks or for collaboration in any sort of way, aside from what we've kind of discussed already.
I'm personally not aware of any, but I certainly agree with everything Eric just said. And being that I'm someone that's doing a lot of the outreach for this, I do feel like it is coming near a time that, yes, the collaborative needs to be formed, but also just people on different sides of the situation on having different viewpoints need to kind of come together and work together to find solutions, rather than looking at each other as adversaries. Just trying to develop a working relationship and let's get through this because it needs to happen.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Hank. I just want to thank everybody for attending. I would love to thank our speakers, Eric and Mike representing the Kalispel Tribe, and then Hank Jones, information about the Priest River efforts to restore cold water fisheries. Thank you all for joining us. We will send an email to everybody with links that we shared in the chat box. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me at reese@idahorivers.org. And yeah, stay tuned for news on the Priest River and opportunities to stay engaged. So thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Guys, I'm going to leave my email address in the chat. So before you sign off, I'm happy to field questions from you. So yeah, feel free.